Hey class, today we're going to read chapter 10, Sodbusters, on page 140. So before we get into reading the whole unit, we're going to just take a look at the look for. What challenges did the Tainter family face in their first year on the prairie? How did the U.S. government encourage people to settle in farming areas? How was the arrival of railroads both good and bad? How did the railroads change western Minnesota? And finally, who were the Grangers and what did they do? Also, I want us to look at the key terms: the Homestead Act, subsistence farming, diversified farming, cooperative, and land speculator. Those key terms are an assignment, and we'll look at them a little bit as we go through this. So, Minnesota was emerging from a turbulent time. The Dakota had tried and failed to win back their lands. The Civil War had ended. The state was heading into what most people assumed would be a time of peace and prosperity, a prosperity based largely on agriculture. Southern Minnesota appeared to be superb farming country. The land was relatively flat. Its rich soil would nourish many kinds of crops. It had just about everything going for it, except that it hadn't been broken yet. The unbroken prairie land of Minnesota was covered with tall grasses that had a heavy tangle of roots called sod. For thousands of years, the sod had fed the plants that gave food and shelter to insects, birds, and animals. Those in turn had made life possible for people. The thick sod also protected the soil beneath it and stored water during dry seasons. It was the soil underneath that held much promise for farming. By the late 1860s, settlers were pouring into Minnesota hoping to make a living off this rich land. Yet there were a great mix of people: Yankees from New England states and New York, as well as Canadians. Page 142. Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Irish, and English. They all knew that farming in Minnesota would be hard work. Before they could plant any crops, they would have to cut through the sod to get to the rich soil underneath. But they were confident that it would be worth the effort. Okay, now we're going to the heading, Starting Small in Lincoln County. In September of 1878, a covered wagon led by a man and pulled by a team of oxen came to a stop on a wide expanse of prairie. The man, John Tainter, could tell that this was the right place. He and his wife, Sarah, had staked claim on 80 acres of land in this previous spring. John looked at his wife and smiled. "Well, we've got home," he said. Sarah gazed over the landscape. All she saw was tall grass rippling in the breeze. There were no houses to be seen, no trees. This was her new home? She burst into tears. After reassuring words from her husband, Sarah found the courage to face the work in front of her. She wiped her eyes, climbed down from the wagon, and set forth for the first time on Lincoln County soil. The Tainters had come to this place with their 3 children to start a new life. Their first job was to put a roof over their heads. The next morning, John set off for Canby, the nearest town 18 miles away. He came back with some lumber and got to work. A few days later, the Tainters moved into a small shanty that would be their home for years to come. Most farmers built houses out of milled lumber, just as the Tainters did, but if they couldn't afford to buy lumber, they had to use materials that were easy to find. If there was woods nearby, they would cut logs for a cabin. On the treeless prairies of southern and western Minnesota, settlers often built their first house from blocks of sod. The Tainters were not the first settlers to move to Lincoln County, nor were they the last. The government had surveyed the county and opened it up for settlement in 1871. Take a look at the bottom of page 142, and I will read the caption to the picture. The Tainters' first house, built in 1878, was constructed for utility, not beauty. The black tar paper minimalized the drafts, and the board sloping to the barrel collected rainwater. Now, if you go to the top of page 143, you can see an image of a sod house. Leaky, dirty, and full of bugs, sod houses were a temporary solution for shelter. Most settlers built wooden houses as soon as they could. All right. People had been staking claims under the federal government's Homestead Act ever since. By 1878, when the Tainters arrived, several hundred families were living there, getting by as best as they could. The Tainters and other early settlers in Lincoln County were subsistence farmers. At first, producing just enough food to feed themselves and trade with neighbors. Typically, during their first year, Lincoln County farmers broke a few acres and planted crops, such as potatoes, turnips, and corn. Sometimes they planted wheat, but usually it was just enough to make flour for their own use. The nearest grist mill was 35 miles away. Even if they did produce extra grain, they had no easy, reliable way to bring it to the market. Years later, the Tainters and other early settlers told stories about the challenges they faced on the prairie during those early years. They recalled their struggles to keep their families decently fed and the 4 summers in a row during the 1870s when enormous swarms of grasshoppers obscured the sun and destroyed the crops. They remembered the incredibly long, harsh winter of 1880-81 when settlers tied a clothesline to their house and themselves before venturing outside so they could find their way back home in the deep snow. But they also told stories about good times and the fun children had during these winters, sliding and down snow-covered rooftops, and about simple holiday celebrations when family members gave each other pincushions and dolls made from secret scraps of cloth. Okay, on the side of 143, please look at the Homestead Act. That's one of our keyword terms. 1862 law that provides up to 160 acres of land to settlers who would live on it and farm it for 5 years. So it was called opening up the frontier. The federal government passed the Homestead Act, and if you were willing to go out on a farm or farm the land or try to make the land productive, they would give you 160 acres of land to settle. And after 5 years, you got the land. The key thing here is 160 acres. 160 acres would produce enough food for you to live on, grow crops, and be able to survive and actually make some money. However, when you get farther west and the climate is drier, 160 acres is not enough land. And mostly you can only ranch on that land. The second key term there is subsistence farmers. That is, families who produce only enough food to feed themselves, but not enough to sell at market. So they're just living on the land, making enough food for their family to survive. All right, let's take a look down at the bottom of page 143 and the picture, and I'll read the caption there. To fight the grasshopper plagues, farmers tried everything they could, squashing the pests, capturing them with nets like the ones shown here, trapping them in tar, burning the fields, and praying. I can't imagine that I would feel anything but helpless if I was in that situation. Turning the page, let's take a look at the top of the page and let's read farm life highlighted in yellow. Every family had plenty of work to do. If someone needed help, the other family members would pitch in. But even though they shared the work, men, women, and children had different jobs on the farm. For a man, farming meant heavy work in the fields when the farmer was not busy plowing, planting, or harvesting. He had to repair buildings and care for the animals. With a few neighbors, a farmer had to rely on his own skill as a logger, veterinarian, lawyer, well digger, and accountant. A farm woman's job ended only when her strength ran out. She tended to have children, cooked 3 meals a day over a wood-burning stove. She rubbed her hands raw during the laundry over a rough metal washboard. Dirt was everywhere. She made soap, sewed clothes, mended clothes, and preserved fruits and vegetables for winter. She also cared for the chickens and cows and made butter and cheese from the cow's milk. The vegetable garden was usually her job. As soon as the children were big enough, they carried firewood and brought water from the well, weeding the garden. Gathering eggs and bringing in the cows for milking were other chores for boys and girls. When they were older, they helped in the fields or cared for the younger brothers and sisters. Changes on the farm. The experiences of the Tainters are very similar to those of the early settlers in Minnesota. The first years were always the hardest. It wasn't enough to have a piece of land. Farm families needed a house, a barn, fences, tools, animals, seed, and many more things. All of these cost money. Even with inexpensive land, farmers often had to borrow money to get started. They needed plows, axes, spades, pitchforks, scythes, pots, pans, stoves, needles, thread, and all sorts of other tools and household goods. Without these things, the farm families could not work. Most farmers also owned a team of oxen. Oxen were slower than horses, but they could pull heavy loads and plows. Many families also had a cow or two and a few chicken or pigs. Many of the early settlers were subsistence farmers first, but like the Tainters, they did not want to continue to grow crops for their families alone. As soon as they were established, they worked hard to better themselves by growing crops to sell. They needed a cash crop with a reliable market. During the 1860s and 70s, this often meant planting wheat. Wheat was a relatively easy crop to cultivate, and prices were good because demand for wheat flour was growing. Meanwhile, many Minnesota farmers depended almost entirely on wheat, but that turned out to be a mistake. One crop farming demanded too much soil and depleted the nutrients. If you go to the picture in the bottom of 144, cutting through the dense sod was grueling, back-breaking work. Oxen were needed to pull the plow through the thick tangle of grass and roots. Okay, now let's try to finish page 145. Also, farmers depended on just one crop had a more difficult time earning money when prices fell. This happened when harvests were so good that farmers produced more of their crop than they could sell. Farm families realized they'd be better off if they could produce a variety of crops and livestock. This was called diversified farming. But how would they learn to do this? They could learn by sharing information with each other. In 1867, 7 settlers, including Oliver H. Kelly of Elk River, Minnesota, founded the first nationwide farmers association. It was called the Grange, Patrons of Husbandry. The Grange was an organization which farming men and women could share their concerns, learn about new ways to succeed on the farm, and enjoy each other's companies. The Grangers gathered for socials and lectures on farming topics. They also joined together to form cooperatives to sell their produce and buy things they needed on the farm. Unlike most organizations of the time, the Grange also welcomed women as equal members. By 1869, Minnesota had 40 local Granges, more than any other state. 5 years later, it had 538. At first, the Grangers stayed away from politics. They thought it might threaten the unity of their organization, but it didn't take long for the Grangers to become politically active. Many of them banded together against what they believed was their common enemy, the railroad. This was quite a switch. During the early days of settlements, most people in rural Minnesota had looked forward to the railroad's arrival. Going to the right of the page, diversified farming, the practice of producing a variety of crops and livestock. Cooperative, an organization that formed to buy or sell products in order to get better prices. Finish the rest of the page by yourself. We'll stop here at 145 and pick it up next time. Thank you.